We were sent to Khamar Daban, a remote mountain range in Siberia, but what we found there no one was ever meant to see. A silence, thicker than any battlefield I've known, and something watching us from the shadows. We thought it was just the land. We were wrong. And that's when we realized this wasn't just another mission. I was a corporal in a Special Forces recon unit, part of the 22nd Infantry Division. It was the winter of 1997, and we were sent to a place few had ever heard of, Khamar Daban, deep in Siberia. The mission was as standard as they come. We were to infiltrate the mountains, conduct reconnaissance, and report back on any signs of enemy activity in the region. Just another routine check, or so we thought. The intel was scarce, but there had been murmurs about strange signals, unreported activity, and missing patrols. They didn't want to put us in harm's way, but they knew there was something off in those mountains. The operation was called Operation Silent Ridge. The brief was short, and the objective was clear: get in, stay low, and gather whatever intelligence we could find on insurgents in the region. Standard reconnaissance. Our loadout was nothing out of the ordinary. Rifles, night vision scopes, survival gear, radio equipment, and a few days' worth of rations. The usual. We were given our marching orders, and that was it. We didn't even question it. The briefing room was dimly lit, the air thick with smoke from the officers' cigarettes. There was no sign of urgency, just a matter-of-fact attitude. Captain Ivanov, our commanding officer, laid out the plan on a map, marking the village we were to secure and the surrounding areas for scouting. But there was something odd about that map. I'd never seen it before, at least not in the way it was drawn. The valley itself was marked in a dark red circle, and there were several lines that led into the mountains with no clear explanation. The captain didn't mention it, but I noticed the blank spots on the map. There was a strange gap in our intelligence. It was like there was a hole in the data, something that didn't make sense. A piece missing. Before we left, the interpreter, an old man from the region who had worked with us before, pulled me aside. He was nervous, looking over his shoulder like someone was listening. He told me that the land was cursed. He said the mountains had a history, one that was buried deep. La Llorona, he said, his voice shaking. The mountains speak of her, and the land remembers. I didn't understand at the time. Who listens to old folklore when you're on a mission like this? But he was terrified, that much was clear. I just thought he was spooked. But now, I wonder if he knew something we didn't. But that was only the beginning. We left the base early, just after dawn. The convoy rolled out slowly, kicking up dust as it made its way through the barren, snow-covered roads. The sun barely peeked over the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch for miles in every direction. The hum of the trucks, the crunch of tires on snow, nothing out of the ordinary. It felt like any other routine mission. I remember Miller, one of the younger privates, trying to lighten the mood. He cracked a joke about how this was just another standard mission, that we'd be back in camp in time for dinner. I laughed along with him, even though I knew something about this mission didn't sit right with me. The longer we traveled, the quieter it became. The radio was mostly silent, the occasional static breaking the stillness. The journey was uneventful at first. We passed small villages, empty fields, and the occasional lone cabin, abandoned long ago. There was a palpable tension in the air, but it was the kind of tension you'd expect on a mission like this. We were far from home, in an unfamiliar land, with only a small team and sparse intel to go on. But that was nothing new for us. We were trained for it. This wasn't the first time we'd been sent to remote, hostile areas. The banter continued among the men, standard jokes about food, about what we'd do when we got back, and a lot of talk about the cold. It was freezing, but we'd been in worse. It wasn't until we started to get closer to the valley that the unease set in. We passed the last settlement before entering the valley, and that's when I noticed something strange. There were no signs of life. No people, no animals, nothing. The air was too still, and the silence felt unnatural. The few people we passed in, the last village didn't make eye contact. They just looked at the ground, avoiding us. That's when the first sense of dread hit me. We were too far into the unknown now, and everything felt wrong. We pulled off the main road and started down a narrow path that wound through the trees. The trees were tall and dark, their branches bare against the cold. There was no wind, no rustling of leaves, just an eerie stillness that seemed to swallow the sound around us. My breath came out in small, visible clouds, and I could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on me. I checked my equipment, but it was all fine. My rifle, my pack, my radio. But then, I heard a slight buzzing sound. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I glanced over at the others. Miller, the guy sitting next to me, didn't seem to notice. I looked down at my radio, trying to get a better signal, but it was just static. It wasn't the cold, and it wasn't the distance. It was something else. Something I couldn't put my finger on. We reached the outskirts of the village around mid-afternoon. The air had grown colder, and there was an unnatural quiet about the place. I got out of the truck, my boots crunching in the snow as I surveyed the area. The houses were old, abandoned. No smoke rising from chimneys, no signs of life at all. It looked like a ghost town. I signaled to the men to spread out and start the sweep. As we moved through the village, I noticed something disturbing. There were no animals. No dogs barking. No livestock in sight. There wasn't even the faintest sound of birds in the trees. It was as if everything had disappeared. We knocked on a few doors, no answer. There were traces of people having lived here recently. Food in the pantry, clothes still hanging in the windows, but no sign of life. The whole place felt abandoned, but not in the way you'd expect. It wasn't like a town that had been hit by the plague or evacuated. It was like the people had vanished overnight. I remember walking past one house, glancing through the window. There was a painting on the wall, a portrait of a family, but there was something about their eyes that unsettled me. They didn't look right. It was like they were staring at me, but not from the canvas. The strangest part? The tracks in the snow. There were footprints leading out of the village, into the trees, but they didn't look like they belonged to people. They were too wide, too deep. It didn't make sense. I stared at them for a moment, but then Miller snapped me out of it. "Quit staring at the snow, Corporal," he called, his voice a little too loud. "We've got a mission to do." I nodded, trying to shake the feeling that was creeping up on me, but we pressed on. The men moved deeper into the village, each of us checking buildings, scanning the area, but the silence was suffocating. Every sound we made felt like a violation of the stillness. That's when we reached the site and everything changed. The further we went into the village, the more something felt off. It wasn't just the silence anymore, it was the weight of the place. The air felt thick, like it was pressing against us, weighing us down. I kept checking my rifle, making sure everything was in place, but my hands were shaking, and I couldn't figure out why. It wasn't just the cold. There was something else in the air, something I couldn't explain. I was walking down the main street when I saw them, footprints. At first, I thought they were just from the previous days. Maybe the villagers had returned, or the few who'd survived had come back to check on the place. But these weren't normal footprints. They were too deep, too wide. The prints were unlike any boots we wore. They were large, heavy, and strange. They didn't make sense for the type of terrain we were on, and there were too many. It was like something, or someone, had walked around this place for days, yet no one had seen anything. I followed the prints for a while, but they led nowhere. They just stopped. Just like that. No trail to follow. They just vanished. I turned back, trying to shake off the feeling creeping up my spine. As I walked, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The temperature had dropped. My breath was coming out in thick clouds, and even though we were in the middle of winter, it didn't feel like the normal cold. It was colder, sharper. It almost felt unnatural. I checked my equipment again. My radio was giving off nothing but static, the needle on my compass. Spinning wildly, it wasn't the cold. Something was interfering with our gear. I switched the radio off, then back on again. Nothing. Miller was walking ahead of me, checking the houses as we went, and I called out to him. "Miller, you getting anything on your radio?" He looked back at me, his face as pale as the snow. Nothing. I thought it was just mine. It's dead, too. The feeling was building. Something wasn't right. It wasn't just the strange silence or the strange footprints. It was everything. The absence of life, the cold that seemed to freeze my very soul, the interference with our equipment. It was like we were being watched. Every step I took felt like I was being pulled deeper into something. and I had no idea what it was. But the others didn't seem to notice. They were too busy checking the buildings, going through the motions of our mission. They didn't see what I was seeing, or maybe they just didn't want to. I looked at the house nearest to me, a small shack, abandoned just like the others. I noticed something strange painted on the outside of the door, a symbol. It was crude, hastily scratched into the wood, like someone had done it in a hurry. I stepped closer, my fingers itching to touch it, but something stopped me. The air around it felt wrong. The symbol was familiar, but I couldn't place it. I'd seen similar ones before in old books, but I couldn't remember where. It was circular, with sharp, jagged lines running through it, almost like a warning. I took a step back, and that's when I heard it, the faintest of sounds. A low creak, followed by a faint whisper. I turned around quickly, heart pounding in my chest, but there was nothing. The silence swallowed the sound whole, the kind of silence that made your skin crawl. I looked around at the others. No one seemed to hear it. I swallowed hard, trying to shake off the dread settling in my gut. But I knew something was wrong here. But that was just the beginning. We'd been moving through the village for hours, but nothing seemed right. The place had this oppressive, suffocating feel to it, like we were trespassing in a land that didn't belong to us anymore. The silence was getting worse. At first, it was just the quiet of an empty town, but now it felt like the silence itself was watching us. I tried to keep my mind focused on the mission, check the perimeter, ensure the area was clear, gather intel, but my gut told me we weren't alone. It wasn't just the eerie quiet, it was the feeling that something was waiting, watching. Then it started, a low sound, almost like a whisper, but not quite. It was distant at first, like the wind carrying something across the mountains. But when I listened closer, I realized it wasn't wind. It was a voice, a woman's voice, soft, almost a sob. La Llorona. I heard Miller say it first, and I froze. He didn't speak the words loudly, almost in disbelief, but the way his voice cracked told me Head heard it too. The interpreter, who had been eerily quiet up until that point, suddenly turned pale. He looked over his shoulder, scanning the empty streets as if he expected to see something. "She's here," he whispered, barely audible. "She calls for us. We are cursed." I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't ignore the way my skin crawled. The voice grew louder, closer, but the source was still hidden. It was the kind of sound that felt like it was echoing from inside your head, wrapping around your thoughts, drawing you in. The air grew heavier. My hands started to shake. I checked my radio. The static was unbearable, screeching through the air, louder than anything we'd heard before. I tried to raise the command base, but nothing came through. Just static crackling like an old fire, but no voice, no clarity. I turned to the others. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with uncertainty. "Is anyone else hearing that?" I asked, my voice tight. Nobody answered, but their expressions said it all. I could hear Miller muttering to himself, shaking his head, trying to convince himself it was just the wind, just stress, that we were all imagining it. But the way he kept looking over his shoulder told me he wasn't so sure anymore. Then came the real shock. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure. At first, it was just a shadow in the distance, moving in and out of view between the trees. I thought it was one of the men, but when I blinked, the figure was gone. The others didn't seem to notice, or if they did, they didn't say anything. I called out, "Who's out there?" But no one responded. I turned back toward the group, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. And then she appeared. The woman, standing in the middle of the street, shrouded in white. Her back was turned, but I could feel her presence. It wasn't just the sight of her, it was the weight she carried with her. The wail grew louder, clearer, and I knew it was her, La Llorona, the woman in white, the one who was said to wander the lands, mourning her lost children. I felt my heart race as I looked at the others. They were frozen in place too. None of us knew what to do. The air had thickened, the temperature had dropped. Even my breath felt like it was coming in ragged gasps, visible in the frigid air. "She's real," the interpreter muttered. His voice was trembling, his face drenched in sweat despite the cold. "She never stops. She calls and she never lets go." And that's when the real shock came, when we realized this wasn't just a mission anymore. We stood there frozen, staring at her. La Llorona, the figure in white, her long hair cascading down her back, her face hidden by the veil. Her form was barely visible in the fog, but we could feel her presence, cold, suffocating, like the air itself had thickened with grief. The wailing had stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. It wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive. It pressed in on us, weighing down our chests, choking us. I could feel my breath shortening, my heart hammering in my chest. We were soldiers, trained to handle combat, trained to face death. But this was something else. The woman didn't move. She just stood there, facing away from us, her body rigid, her hands hanging loosely at her sides. It was like she was waiting for us to make the first move. I wanted to speak, to tell the others to stay calm, but my throat was tight, my voice lost. Then, the ground trembled. It wasn't much at first, a slight vibration like the earth itself was shifting. But the feeling was undeniable. We all felt it. The earth beneath our boots seemed to hum with energy, and then, suddenly, the wail returned. Louder, more intense. It wasn't a cry anymore, it was a shriek, an agonizing sound that seemed to shake the very air around us. I looked around at the men. Some had their rifles raised, others were staring at the figure, unsure what to do. But none of us fired. We couldn't. It didn't feel right. And then it happened. The first soldier to move was Miller. He took a step toward her, just one step. But the moment he did, she turned. Her face, or what should have been a face, was a black void. Hollow eyes stared back at him, and her mouth opened wide, emitting an unearthly scream. A scream that cut through our bones, a scream so loud, so pure in its torment, that I thought my ears would bleed. Miller dropped his rifle. His hands went to his head and he screamed, but it wasn't a scream of pain. It was like he was being pulled apart. His mind, his body, everything. His eyes were wide with terror, his mouth open, but no sound came out. And then, she moved. She wasn't walking anymore. It was more like she was gliding, a part of the air itself. She was on him before any of us could react. Her fingers, long and twisted, wrapped around his throat, and he was pulled to the ground. His body jerked violently, like he was fighting an invisible force, but it was useless. We opened fire, all of us, but the bullets didn't seem to matter. They passed through her, like she wasn't even there. The rounds hit the ground behind her, leaving no mark, no blood. She didn't flinch. She didn't even acknowledge us. I saw one of the soldiers break. His hands were shaking as he tried to raise his rifle, but it was clear he wasn't thinking straight. Fear had taken over. Another man ran, bolting back towards the village. But he never made it. We heard him scream, and when we turned, all we saw was a shadow, flickering in the fog, then disappearing. My training kicked in. I pulled the men back, shouting at them to regroup. But no one was listening. Everyone was paralyzed by fear. The wailing, the blackness of her eyes, the horrible way she moved. It was too much. La Llorona wasn't just a ghost. She wasn't just some wraith from a folktale. She was a force, a supernatural force tied to the land itself. We weren't fighting for survival anymore. We were fighting to escape, to get out alive. Miller's body lay motionless, still gripped by her cold hands. There was no blood, no sign of struggle, just the empty, hollow eyes staring back at us. And that's when everything changed. We didn't hesitate. The moment we saw Miller's body, I ordered the retreat. We turned and ran, stumbling through the snow, but the weight of the creature's presence still bore down on us. The air was thick, heavy, and every step felt like it was pulling us deeper into the abyss. We didn't know where to go, but the chopper had to be our only chance. The firefight was chaotic. We fired blindly at shadows, but nothing worked. The woman, La Llorona, wasn't there anymore, but her wail echoed in our heads. The fog thickened, the ground trembling beneath us as if the earth itself was fighting against us. We finally reached the clearing, but half the men were gone. Some had fallen back during the chaos, but others, I'm not sure what happened to them. When we made it to the chopper, we were barely able to keep our heads together. Back at base, everything was covered up. The captain wouldn't speak about it, and when we tried to report what happened, we were told to keep quiet. The mission was classified, the files sealed. No one was supposed to know what we'd seen. No one was ever supposed to talk about it. But what happened next took things to another level. I've tried to forget it. I've tried to push it all away, but there's no escaping it. The sound of her wail, the shadow in the fog, the emptiness in Miller's eyes. I've seen things on battlefields that should've been left to the history books, but this wasn't a story. It was real. And it's still out there, still waiting.